They didn't just cross a line, they erased the only thing standing between my daughter and a winter that kills people who underestimate it. And they did it with a smile, like they were fixing a problem instead of creating one. HOA Karen didn't knock, didn't ask, didn't even pretend to care. She just showed up with her authority wrapped in plastic and set fire to 4 months of preparation like it was trash she was tired of looking at. I didn't hear the first crack of wood burning. I smelled it. Sharp, wrong, out of place. And by the time I stepped outside, it was already too late to stop what she had started. Flames rolled through my stockpile like it had been waiting for permission, like everything I built was just fuel for her decision. My hands didn't move right away. My voice didn't come out, because what I was looking at wasn't damage. It was removal, intentional, controlled, complete. She stood there just far enough away to stay clean, clipboard tucked under her arm, watching it burn like it proved something. Violation resolved, she said, like it was routine, like she hadn't just stripped a house of heat in sub-zero country. I didn't answer her, not because I didn't have something to say, but because anything said in that moment would have been smaller than what she deserved. My daughter stood in the doorway behind me, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't going to be enough in 2 days, watching the fire eat through the last of our margin. That's when I understood something. HOA Karen did, before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? She thought she had removed an eyesore, but what she actually did was remove the one thing keeping pressure balanced. And once balance breaks in a place like this, something else always moves to correct. The fire burned out fast, faster than it should have, which told me everything I needed to know about how it started, because wood that dry doesn't ignite like that without help. When the flames dropped and the smoke thinned, there wasn't anything left to salvage, just blackened fragments, and heat bleeding into cold air that was already reclaiming the space. HOA Karen wrote something down, didn't even look at me, and walked back to her SUV like she had finished a task. No hesitation, no second thought, no understanding of what she had actually done. The engine turned, tires moved, and just like that, she left the consequences behind, like they belonged to me alone. That's where she made her first mistake. I didn't move toward the ashes. I moved away from them, because standing there staring at loss doesn't fix anything, and reacting too early gives people like her exactly what they want, a moment they can control, a reaction they can frame. I walked past the edge of my property, past the line she thought defined where her authority ended and mine began, and kept going towards something she didn't even know existed in any real sense. The spillway wasn't visible from her angle, wasn't listed in her rules, wasn't something she could inspect or regulate or fine. It was older than her system, older than her authority, older than the entire neighborhood she thought she controlled. My grandfather built it when this land still answered to reality instead of paperwork, and he didn't build it for appearance. He built it for pressure. The hatch sat under a layer of snow that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Quiet, unremarkable, exactly the kind of thing people ignore when we don't understand what it does. I cleared it without thinking, hands moving on instinct, not rushed, not panicked, just precise. The key wasn't something I had to search for. It stayed with me the same way anything important does, always within reach, always ready. When it slid into the lock, there was resistance, not from damage, but from time, like it had been waiting long enough to matter again. I didn't force it. I turned it slow. One rotation, just enough to wake something up. There was no explosion, no immediate reaction, just a shift, subtle, almost silent, the kind of change you don't notice unless you know exactly what to listen for. Beneath the frozen surface above, water moved, not freely yet, but aware, adjusting, responding to something it hadn't felt in years. That's the thing about systems like this. They don't forget what they're built to do. They just wait for the moment they're needed again. I stopped there, didn't open it fully, didn't release anything yet, because this wasn't about immediate response. This was about timing. Behind me, the house was already losing heat. Inside, Maggie was sitting closer to the stove than usual, wrapped tighter than she needed to be a week ago, watching the temperature drop in a way no teenager should have to think about. She didn't ask if we were in trouble. She didn't panic. She just looked at me the way she always does when something shifts, waiting to see what I would do next. That look carries weight, more than anything HOA Karen could ever write down or enforce, because it doesn't ask for comfort. It asks for certainty. I told her we were fine, not because we were, but because we would be. That difference matters. The storm was already building outside, not dramatic yet, not loud, but steady. Layers of snow stacking in a way that turns small problems into something bigger if you don't stay ahead of it. The forecast had been clear for days. Heavy accumulation, followed by a rapid shift in temperature that would push everything that fell into motion all at once. Snowpack turns into pressure. Pressure turns into movement, and movement always finds the path it was designed to take, unless something blocks it, or unless someone removes that block at exactly the the right time. HOA Karen didn't understand any of that. She operated on rules that existed in a controlled environment, one where consequences were predictable, manageable, contained. But she had stepped outside that system without realizing it, made a decision that interacted with something she didn't have authority over, and now the outcome wasn't hers to control any. The night came down hard, colder than it should have been that early. The kind of cold that doesn't warn you, just settles in and stays. The house held what heat it could, but without the stockpile, without the margin we built, every hour started to matter more. I adjusted what I could, rationed what was left, stretched every resource as far as it would go, but there's a limit to that. There's always a limit. At 2:14 a.m., I stepped outside again. Not because something triggered me, because something had changed. The air felt different, heavier, the kind of shift you notice when pressure builds to a point where it's about to move whether you allow it or not. I looked up toward the reservoir, couldn't see it through the storm, but I didn't need to. I knew what was happening up there, knew how much weight was sitting on top of ice that wasn't meant to hold it indefinitely, and I knew exactly where that weight would go. It started to move. Back inside, Maggie's breathing had changed. Not worse, but strained, the kind that tells you time isn't something you can ignore any. I sat beside her for a moment, just long enough to make sure she was steady, just long enough to remind myself what this was really about. Not the HOA, not the fire, not the rule, survival. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked at the key hanging where it always had. The spillway wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon. It was a correction, and corrections don't ask for permission. They happen when the system demands it. Outside, the storm kept building. Inside, the pressure kept rising, and somewhere above us, under ice and snow and everything HOA Karen thought she controlled, something was getting ready to move. Not because I forced it, because she made it necessary. Nothing about that land was accidental, and nothing about my position on it was temporary, no matter how hard HOA Karen tried to treat it like something she could redefine. Paperwork pressure. That place existed long before her authority, before her board, before her rules ever touched the edges of it, and the difference between those timelines mattered more than anything she ever wrote on a violation notice. My grandfather didn't choose that ridge for comfort. He chose it because it held under pressure, because elevation meant visibility, because proximity to the reservoir came with responsibility that most people avoided, and because when you build something meant to last, you don't ask for permission from systems that didn't exist when the foundation was poured. The deed reflected that mindset, not in obvious ways, not in language meant to impress, but in clauses buried deep enough that only someone looking for function instead of appearance would understand their weight. Full control of the spillway, full authority over the emergency release system, not shared, not conditional, not subject to HOA review, because the people who wrote that document understood something HOA Karen never did. When pressure builds, hesitation destroys, and authority has to be clear before the moment arrives, not negotiated during. When I came back after years of operating in places where control never lasted longer than the next shift conditions, I didn't want something that looked stable. I wanted something that was stable, something that didn't depend on anyone else maintaining it, something that didn't change based on who thought they were in charge that week. The cabin wasn't impressive. It wasn't built for show. It was built to endure, to hold heat, to resist weather, to function without needing constant adjustment. That mattered more than anything HOA Karen valued, because her system was built on appearance, on maintaining a look, on controlling what people saw instead of what actually kept them alive when things stopped working the way they expect. Preparation wasn't a reaction. It was routine, something that started long before winter showed up, long before the first temperature dropped, long before anyone else thought about what they would need. The woodpile wasn't excess. It was margin. It was stored time, hours of work converted into survival that could be used when the grid failed, when the roads closed, when everything people relied on stopped responding. The shed wasn't storage. It was protection, a barrier between what we needed and the conditions that would try to take it away. Reinforced, sealed, built to hold underweight that would crush anything built for looks instead of function. Maggie grew up inside that system, not shielded from it, not treated like she didn't need to understand it, but included in it, learning early that comfort isn't guaranteed, and stability isn't something you assume will be there when you need it. She didn't complain about the work, didn't question why we prepared more than anyone else, didn't treat it like something unnecessary, because she understood what it represented. Not fear, not paranoia, but readiness. The difference between reacting and already being ahead of what was coming. The neighbors around us operated differently, and that difference became obvious the longer I watched how they moved through their lives. They trusted systems they didn't control, relied on services they didn't maintain, assumed everything would continue working because it always had, and that assumption shaped everything they they did. Their homes looked perfect, their yards stayed clean, their compliance stayed consistent. But none of that meant anything when conditions shifted outside the narrow range those systems were built to handle. HOA Karen thrived in that environment because her authority depended on that mindset, on people believing the system was absolute, on people accepting enforcement without verification, on people choosing compliance over questioning because it was easier. She didn't need to prove her authority, she just needed people to assume it existed, and once that assumption took hold, everything else followed naturally. The first time she approached me, she expected the same response she had always received: adjustment, negotiation, eventual compliance, because that's how her system functioned. What she encountered instead wasn't resistance in the way she understood it, it was indifference to her authority, a refusal to treat her interpretation as fact, and that difference created a crack she didn't recognize at first. When I referenced the actual covenants, when I pointed out clauses that didn't exist, when I refused to align with her version of the rules, the foundation of her authority shifted slightly. Not enough to collapse, but enough to destabilize. She responded the only way she knew how: by increasing pressure, by introducing more notices, more fines, more language designed to push compliance before resistance could spread. That escalation wasn't random. It followed a pattern she had used before, one that relied on people backing down once the pressure reached a certain point. But pressure only works when the system behind it is real, and the moment it's measured against something stronger, something verifiable, something grounded in actual authority instead of assumed control, it starts to fail. The backstory of that land, the authority tied to it, and the preparation built into it didn't change because HOA Karen decided to ignore it. It remained exactly what it was: stable, functional, ready. What changed was the moment those two systems came into direct conflict, one built on reality, on necessity, on survival, and the other built on perception, on control, on rules that only held as long as no one challenged them. That conflict didn't explode immediately. It built slowly, quietly, the way pressure always does, until it reached a point where one system had to give way to the other. And when that moment came, there was never any question which one would hold. HOA Karen didn't build her control overnight. She layered it slowly, quietly, turning small, forgettable rules into something sharp enough to cut through people who never intended to fight back. And that's how she made it stick. It started with harmless language, phrases like visual harmony and community standards, words that sound cooperative until someone decides they mean whatever she needs them to mean in that moment. And once that shift happens, the rule stops being guidance and starts becoming leverage. She understood that better than anyone else on that board, understood that power doesn't come from the rule itself. It comes from how confidently you enforce it and how little people question it when you do. The first notices she sent were soft, almost polite, written in a tone that suggested cooperation while quietly removing choice, and most people accepted them without looking twice, because compliance was easier than digging into whether the rule even existed in the way she presented. That's where her system gained strength, not from accuracy, but from repetition, from the fact that nobody pushed back hard enough to expose the difference between what was written and what she claimed was written. Every time someone adjusted their porch, moved their storage, paid a fine without verifying, her authority expanded just a little more until it stopped being something she used and became something she expected. That expectation shaped everything she did next, because once you believe your control is absolute, you stop checking whether it actually is. The enforcement wasn't consistent, and that inconsistency was the crack she didn't see forming under her feet. The same paint color approved on one house became a violation on another. The same structures advertised in brochures suddenly became visual obstructions when they belonged to someone she'd decided to target. And that selective application wasn't random, it was strategic, aimed at people she believed wouldn't fight back. Most didn't. They adjusted quietly, complained privately, and moved on, reinforcing her belief that her interpretation was enough to hold the system together. But selective enforcement doesn't strengthen authority, it weakens it, because the moment someone pays attention, the pattern becomes visible, and once the pattern is visible, it stops being enforceable in the way she expects. Maggie saw it before most adults did, noticed how the rules shift depending on who they were applied to, how certain houses never got flagged while others were watched constantly, how HOA Karen's own property somehow stayed perfectly within standards no matter what she changed. Information moved through the neighborhood in quiet conversations, in side comments, in the kind of observations people make when they don't want to confront something directly but can't ignore it either. HOA Karen relied on that. that silence, on people keeping those observations to themselves, because as long as they stayed private, they didn't threaten her control. The escalation followed a clear path, and once I saw it, I knew exactly where it was going. First came the notice, then the warning, then the fine, then the threat of enforcement, and finally, action. Each step designed to increase pressure without requiring direct confrontation. It's an efficient system when it works, because it pushes people into compliance before they ever reach the point of resistance, but it only works if the person on the receiving end accepts the premise. I didn't. When I questioned her, when I referenced the actual bylaws instead of her version, when I refused to adjust based on language that didn't exist, the sequence broke. Not visibly at first, not in a way that caused immediate collapse, but internally, the system lost alignment. HOA Karen responded the only way she knew how, by pushing harder, by increasing the frequency of notices, by raising the stakes with fines that grew faster than they should have, each one carrying an assumption that I wouldn't challenge it, that I would eventually fall into the same pattern everyone else had. The fines came from nowhere, tied to clauses that didn't exist, structured in a way that looked official enough to pass if you didn't verify it, and most people wouldn't have. That's how she maintained control, by operating in the space between what people believe and what they actually knew. But every notice she sent, every fine she issued, every clause she referenced got document checked, cross-referenced against the real bylaws, and the gaps started to stack up. What she thought was pressure became evidence. What she thought was enforcement became overreach, and what she thought was authority started to look like something else entirely. Neighbors began noticing, not because I told them to, but because the pattern was now visible, because someone wasn't complying, wasn't adjusting, wasn't backing down, and that alone was enough to make people question something they had accepted for too long. That's how systems like hers start to weaken, not through direct attack, but through exposure, through the simple act of not participating in the illusion that holds them together. HOA Karen didn't adjust, didn't step back, didn't reconsider, because doing that would have meant acknowledging the flaw, and once you acknowledge the flaw, you lose the authority built on ignoring. Instead, she doubled down, escalated faster, and crossed the line she didn't even realize was there. The moment she moved from enforcing rules to taking action she had no right to take, the system stopped protecting her. Burning that stockpile wasn't enforcement. It wasn't compliance. It was overreach. And overreach at that level doesn't stay contained. It triggers consequences that move beyond the structure she controlled. She thought she was tightening her grip, but what she actually did was remove the one barrier keeping everything stable. And once that barrier was gone, everything else started moving toward correction. The moment the flames died, the story stopped being something HOA Karen could spin and became something that could be measured. And once something becomes measurable, it stops bending to narrative and starts locking into fact. I didn't waste time arguing with what had already happened, because arguments can be twisted, emotions can be reframed, but evidence holds its shape no matter who looks at it. And standing in the ash of what used to be my winter margin, I already knew this wasn't random, wasn't accidental, and wasn't something that would disappear if ignored. The smell alone gave it away. Not just burned wood, but that sharp chemical edge layered into it. Something added to make sure it didn't hesitate. Something introduced to guarantee it finished what it started. That kind of burn doesn't come from chance. It comes from intent, and intent leaves a trail whether the person behind it realizes it or not. I didn't accuse, didn't confront, didn't give HOA Karen anything she could redirect. I document, because documentation doesn't escalate, it builds, and once it reaches a certain point, it doesn't need to argue, it just presents. The cameras had been in place before the fire, not because I expected it to go that far immediately, but because I had already seen the pattern forming, already recognized the direction things were moving, and preparation doesn't wait for confirmation, it anticipates it. The porch camera stayed clear, the shed camera didn't, and that gap told me more than a full recording ever could, because disabling a system isn't absence, it's action, and action creates timing. I lined it up, frame by frame, second by second, identifying exactly when visibility dropped, exactly when someone needed to operate without being seen, and that window narrowed everything down to a sequence that didn't leave room for coincidence. The porch footage filled in what the shed camera couldn't show. Two figures moving with purpose, not wandering, not uncertain, one positioned to watch, the other carrying exactly what they needed to finish the job quickly. The gas can flashed once under the light, just enough to confirm what I already suspected, and then they moved out of frame, leaving behind something that would erase itself before anyone else could respond. That kind of coordination doesn't come from impulse, it comes from planning, and planning creates accountability whether the people involved expect it to or not. I saved everything, not once, not twice, but across systems, local, cloud, timestamps locked, because evidence only matters if it survives the moment it's needed most. The fire report added weight, not speculation, not assumption, just observation, origin point, burn pattern, accelerant indicators, all aligning with what the footage already showed. The chief didn't need to name anyone, didn't need to assign blame, because his job wasn't to tell the story, it was to confirm the cause, and once cause is confirmed, everything else follows naturally. HOA Karen didn't know any of this yet, didn't understand that what she thought was a finished action was actually the beginning of something she couldn't control, because she was still operating under the assumption that her system defined the boundaries of consequence. That assumption gave me time, and time is the one advantage you don't waste when you know exactly how to use it. The documentation didn't stop at the fire, it expanded backward, pulling in every notice she sent, every clause she referenced, every fine she issued, aligning them against the actual bylaws instead of her version of them. The inconsistencies weren't subtle once they were laid out, clauses that didn't exist, timelines that didn't match, enforcement that exceeded what was allowed, and each one added another layer to something that was becoming impossible to ignore. Maggie contributed without realizing the weight of it. Conversations she overheard, patterns she noticed, details that seemed small on their own but connected into something larger when placed next to everything else. HOA Karen's financial pressure, her need to maintain control, the reasons behind her escalation. All of it added context that turned isolated decisions into a continuous line of intent. Intent matters when you build proof, because it shows direction, it shows purpose, it removes the ability to claim coincidence. The maps came next, the original floodplain, the topographic lines, the engineering reports that had been adjusted or ignored when Phase 3 was built. The spillway path wasn't theoretical, it was documented decades earlier, drawn in a way that made it clear where water would go when pressure exceeded containment. That path ran directly through the area HOA Karen's board approved for development, not because it was safe, but because it was profitable, because ignoring that line made things easier in the short term. I laid the original maps over the modified ones, compared what was supposed to exist against what had been forced into place, and the difference wasn't small, it was structural. The system had been altered to look stable, but underneath it remained exactly what it always was, a path waiting to be used the moment conditions demanded it. I didn't present any of it yet, because timing isn't just important, it's everything. Evidence revealed too early gets dismissed, gets buried, gets reframed, but evidence revealed at the moment outcome aligns with it doesn't need explanation, it becomes undeniable. So I kept building, kept documenting, kept aligning every piece until it formed something complete, something that connected cause to action, to consequence without leaving space for interpretation. The storm added the final layer, snow stacking higher, weight building, pressure increasing in ways that couldn't be ignored or redirected. The reservoir rose, the ground saturated, the system strained under conditions it was always meant to handle, but had been prevented from doing so. And through all of it, the proof stayed intact, waiting, not passive, not idle, but positioned exactly where it needed to be, for the moment it would matter most. Because proof doesn't just expose what happened, it defines what comes next. And when everything finally aligned, when the outcome matched the evidence, there wasn't anything left to argue. The moment it turned wasn't loud. It didn't explode into chaos all at once. It shifted slow at first, then faster than anyone could contain once the reality started catching up to the illusion HOA Karen had been holding together. The water didn't arrive like a disaster. It arrived like a correction, steady, controlled, moving exactly where it was always meant to go, and that's what made it impossible to argue against, because nothing about it was random. At first, people stepped outside, with confusion written across their faces, looking at water where it shouldn't have been, trying to match what they were seeing with what they believed about their perfectly managed neighborhood. HOA Karen had trained them to trust the system, to assume everything was under control, to believe nothing significant could happen without notice, without approval, without her involvement. But this didn't ask for her approval, and that was the first crack everyone could see. The water crept across lawns, slipped into driveways, reached thresholds that were never supposed to be tested, and that's when confusion started turning into realization. action, because once something touches your front step, it stops being theoretical. HOA Karen stepped into the middle of it with the same posture she always carried, phone in hand, voice raised, trying to direct something that didn't recognize her authority, trying to restore control over a system that had already moved past her reach. She issued instructions that nobody followed, not because they chose to ignore her, but because they understood in that moment that she wasn't in control of anything that mattered. The structure she relied on didn't apply here, didn't translate into action, didn't change the outcome unfolding in front of them. Questions started cutting through the noise. Not whispered, not private, but direct, sharp, impossible to avoid. Why was this happening? Why wasn't it prevented? Why were homes built in a place that couldn't handle what was now happening to them? Those questions didn't need answers immediately. They just needed to exist, because once they did, the narrative HOA Karen controlled began to unravel faster than she could respond. The emergency crews arrived, not to restore her authority, but to assess the situation based on reality, and their presence shifted everything. They didn't look to her for direction, didn't defer to her position. They moved past it, evaluating the land, the water flow, the structures, identifying patterns that didn't align with what should have been there. That shift stripped her of the last layer of perceived control she had left, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Documentation surfaced alongside it, maps, reports, records that aligned with what everyone could now see, confirming that this wasn't unexpected, that the floodplain had always existed, that the spillway path wasn't new, just ignored. Information spread faster than she could contain it, phones recording, messages moving, the situation stepping outside the boundaries she relied on to manage perception. Residents who had stayed quiet before started speaking, not all at once, not aggressively, but enough to change the balance. They referenced fines, notices, inconsistencies, experiences that matched each other in ways that formed a pattern, and that pattern pointed directly at the system HOA Karen had been running. She tried to pivot, shifted from authority to explanation, from control to justification, attempting to frame it as something unavoidable, something no one could have predicted, but that narrative collapsed the moment it was compared against documented reality. The evidence didn't argue, it didn't need to, it aligned with what was happening in real time, and that alignment made everything she said sound smaller, weaker, disconnected from what people were experiencing directly. Her position didn't end with a declaration. It didn't require someone to remove her in that moment. It dissolved as people stopped responding to it, stopped looking to her for direction, stopped treating her authority as something that held weight. Authority doesn't disappear with noise. It disappears when it stops being recognized, and that's exactly what happened. By the time the water settled into something manageable, by the time the immediate reaction shifted into assessment, HOA Karen's control was already gone every way that mattered. She still stood there, still tried to speak, still tried to direct, but the system that gave those actions meaning had already collapsed. The confrontation wasn't about who won an argument. It was about what remained standing when everything else was stripped away. And when that moment passed, when the dust settled into something clear, there wasn't anything left for her to hold on to. The collapse had already happened, not in a single moment, but in a sequence she couldn't stop once it started. The moment the water settled, the next phase didn't slow down. It sharpened, because once chaos gives way to clarity, systems that operate on fact step in and start cutting through everything that was built on assumption. HOA Karen's authority couldn't survive that kind of environment, because expert systems don't respond to confidence. They respond to evidence, and evidence doesn't bend to narrative no matter how hard someone tries to shape. The lawsuit came fast, faster than it should have if it had been built carefully, because it wasn't designed to hold under pressure. It was designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, to reframe what had already happened into something they could still control. $42 million in damages, accusations stacked high enough to sound serious, but none of it aligned with the sequence of events that had already been documented. That was their second mistake. They assumed volume would replace accuracy, that throwing enough claims into the air would create confusion. But confusion doesn't survive when everything is already recorded, already aligned, already waiting to be presented in the right order. My lawyer didn't treat it like a fight. He treated it like a timeline, because timelines don't argue, they reveal. The fire came first, intentional, document, verified. The notices came before that, inconsistent, unsupported, forming a pattern that showed escalation. The maps existed long before any construction, defining exactly where pressure would move when it built up. And the spillway, the one thing they tried to frame as the cause, was actually the release point, the mechanism designed to prevent something worse from happening when the system reached its limit. Each piece connected to the next, not loosely, not in interpretively, but directly, and once that connection was laid out, there wasn't anything left to debate. The courtroom didn't amplify emotion, it stripped it away, reduced everything down to what could be proven, and that's where HOA Karen's entire structure collapsed completely. Her legal team tried to build a narrative around unpredictability, around the idea that the flood was an isolated event, something no one could have anticipated, but that argument didn't last long once the original floodplain maps were placed next to the developed plans. The difference wasn't subtle, it was undeniable, and once the judge saw it, the rest of their case lost any ground it had left. The spillway wasn't misused, it was operated under authority that predated their entire system. The water didn't change direction, it followed the path it was always meant to take, and the damage they claimed wasn't caused by an action, it was caused by ignoring what was already there. That's the kind of alignment that ends arguments before they begin, because once cause and effect lock into place, there's no space left for interpretation. The ruling came clean, direct, without hesitation, dismissed, not partially, not conditionally, but completely, with costs pushed back onto the people who tried to force a narrative that didn't match reality. And that wasn't the end of it, because once the court recognizes a pattern that extends beyond a single case, it doesn't stop at dismissal, it expands into investigation. The fire report, the forged documents, the altered maps, all of it moved into a different category, one that HOA Karen had no control over, one that didn't care about her position, her explanations, or her absence. The county stepped in next, not slowly, not cautiously, but with precision, because once liability becomes clear, action follows without delay. Inspection teams moved through Phase 3 with a different objective, not to manage damage, but to determine whether the structures should have existed at all. Elevations were checked, records were pulled, discrepancies that had been ignored before were now treated as violations that required correction, and the conclusion came quickly. Those homes didn't belong there, not according to the land, not according to the original plans, not according to any system that operated on fact instead of assumption. Condemnation orders followed, not as punishment, but as correction, because when something is built on invalid ground, you don't adjust it, you remove it. The demolition didn't carry emotion, it didn't pause for reflection, it moved with purpose, structure by structure, reversing decisions that should never have been approved. What looked like destruction from a distance was actually restoration, the land returning to the function it had always held before someone tried to override it. HOA Karen wasn't there to see any of it, and that absence didn't stop the process, it confirmed it, because accountability doesn't require presence, it proceeds whether the person responsible shows up or not. The organization she led didn't survive the transition either. Once external systems took over, once evidence replaced assumption, the internal structure had nothing left to stand on. The board dissolved, not through confrontation, but through recognition that its authority no longer aligned with reality. And what remained was reduced to something simple: maintenance, basic function, nothing beyond what was necessary. That's how overextended systems end, not with noise, not with resistance, but with contraction, returning to the only role they were ever meant to serve. The retaliation wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't rely on force, it operated through process, through verification, through systems that don't need to assert themselves to be effective. Every step followed the last with precision, every outcome tied directly to a documented cause, and by the time it was over, there wasn't anything left for HOA Karen to argue, because everything she built her authority on had already been stripped down to what it actually was. Nothing came after it, not in the way HOA Karen would have expected, not in the way people imagine when they think about endings that are supposed to feel loud or satisfying or complete, because real endings don't announce themselves, they settle in, quiet, permanent, leaving nothing behind that needs to be resolved. The lower section stayed exactly as it was left after the correction, open, untouched, no attempt to rebuild over something that had already proven it would not hold, no second round of decisions made by people pretending they understood something they had already ignored once. The floodplain wasn't hidden anymore, it wasn't theoretical, it wasn't something you could erase from a plan and hope nobody noticed. It was visible, present, undeniable, and that visibility changed everything. Water moved through it when it needed to, not violently, not unpredictably, just the way it always had before anyone tried to force something else into its path. And watching it do that without resistance made something clear that didn't need explanation. Some systems don't need to be controlled, they need to be respected, and the moment that happens, everything else stabilizes on its own. The shed stood where the old one burned, not rebuilt the same, but reinforced, corrected, every weakness removed before it could be tested again. Every decision made with the understanding of what had been lost and what it took to make sure it didn't happen twice. The wood stacked inside it wasn't excess, it wasn't overkill, it was certainty, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval, something that held its value no matter what system failed around it. Maggie moved through that space without hesitation, without looking over her shoulder, without expecting interruption, because she had already seen what happens when you depend on something that can be taken away, and what happens when you build something that can't. That difference stayed with her, not as fear, not as caution, but as clarity, and clarity doesn't fade once it's earned that way. The neighbors adjusted without needing to be told, without meetings, without enforcement, because once people see the outcome of ignoring reality, they don't need reminders, they change on their own. Conversations replaced silence, preparation replaced assumption, and the environment shifted into something that didn't rely on control to maintain itself. The marker at the spillway remained simple, fixed, not decorative, not symbolic, but factual, a reminder that what exists beneath the surface doesn't disappear just because someone decides not to acknowledge it. I passed it the same way every time, without stopping, without checking, because there was nothing left to confirm. It worked, it always had, and now it was recognized in a way that didn't depend on me explaining it to anyone. No letters came after that, no notices, no attempts to rebuild the structure that had already collapsed. No one stepped forward to take HOA Karen's place because there wasn't a place left to take. Authority without a system doesn't exist, and once the system was stripped back to what it actually was, there was nothing left for anyone to control. HOA Karen didn't come back. No statements, no explanations, no attempt to reinsert herself into something that had already moved past her, and that absence said more than anything she could have tried to say. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, it didn't need to be, because the outcome had already removed her in every way that mattered. The final confirmation didn't come from a document or a decision. It came from silence that didn't break, from the absence of pressure, from the fact that nothing returned to challenge what had been settled. I stood on the porch as winter approached again, the air carrying that same edge it always does, the kind that reminds you nothing about this place has changed except the people who live in it. The house was warm before the storm even started. The shed was full, every system in place without needing adjustment, and nothing external was pressing in, nothing waiting to interfere, nothing positioned to take what had been secured. Maggie stood beside, not asking questions, not looking for reassurance, just there, steady, understanding exactly what had been built and why it mattered. We didn't talk about what happened, didn't revisit it, didn't turn it into something it didn't need to be, because once something is finished at that level, it doesn't need to be repeated. The storm came the way it always does, cold, heavy, relentless, but this time it didn't feel like pressure building. It felt like something we were already ahead of, something that had already been accounted for long before it arrived, and somewhere far enough away to never matter again. HOA Karen existed without the system that once made her relevant, without the authority she believed she controlled, without anything left to stand on. She didn't fight it, didn't return, didn't try to rebuild what she lost. HOA Karen went silent.